Before I start, I particularly want to thank Neil and Dave for organising this evening's experience, and to thank everybody at Arts Avenue for hosting it. And of course, thanks to everybody who's joined us this evening. I knew of Roger long before I knew Roger. I knew of him in the late 70s and early 80s as my Betty pal Chris's exotic cousin. He was a performance artist, he was a junkie, he was living in squalor in Brooklyn. It just didn't get more glamorous than that. But then it did get more glamorous than that when Chris went to Roger's final Academy event with Burroughs in 1982 and stayed with him in a warehouse in East London. And when I found out more and more about his lives in New York, in London and in Brighton, about the festivals and the events he'd organised, the magazines he's published, the people he knew, this was a life well lived. And then we met. It was in the bar of the place. I can't even remember what the show was, but I heard somebody say his name, possibly Neil, who said his name. And we embraced like long-lost relatives. We'd heard about each other for years, but we never actually met, and we did. And ever since then, I knew Roger more as an artist than as Chris's cousin. We presented The Devil's Chauffeur at the ICA at some point in the mid-1990s. It was certainly the most alcohol-fueled event I'd ever seen at that point in my life. And then we kept in regular touch, or actually probably more irregular touch. At some point after we set up the Live Art Development Agency in our study room research library, Roger gave us a complete collection of primary sources, which is the magazine that he'd edited and was probably the first to profile interdisciplinary performance, and was the precursor of Performance magazine, or possibly the contemporary Performance magazine, I'm not too sure. And my favourite cover is this one. It's probably the best magazine cover ever. In 2014, we worked with Roger and Dave Stevens on the DVD of Hinge, the wonderful film about Ian Hinchcliffe, who died 4 years earlier. We launched the DVD in October of that year, an event with Rog, with Dave, Robert Friendly and Nicky Millican. We're based above a craft hipster brewery in Hackney Wick, and the audience were fairly well fueled before the event began. And as most of the audience were Ian's contemporaries and of a certain age, I described the evening as like being on a saga holiday in a drunk tank. But I don't mean to be too disrespectful to my elders, as the evening was also a kind of exhilarating reminder that age does not wither artists, especially performance artists. But I'm not here to talk about that. Let's go on a trip down memory lane. I'm here to really talk about Roger the Polymath, about his extraordinary and influential work as a publisher, an archivist, a curator, and a collector. Roger had been talking about his personal archive for years, and given the huge sort of recent interest in performance histories and Roger's own severe health problems, we'd all agreed that it was a project that needed urgent attention. In November of 2014, I went to visit him in Westwood Grove, and we tried to start this process of making sense of the materials he had and what he wanted to do with them. I knew Roger had done some amazing things, but I had no idea just how amazing until that afternoon. We sat surrounded by boxes and boxes and boxes. And in those boxes were film, audio, photographic documentation, all kinds of events that Roger had curated or performed in or just been at. There were flyers, there were posters, there were brochures, there were tickets, there were programs, there were promotional materials, all kinds of events that he'd organised. There were books, there were magazines, there were journals, including rare and out-of-print things. There were performance art, personal documents, letters, notes. There were interviews, both published and non-published. There was ephemera, there were relics, traces of performance, there were reviews, there were articles, there were even event production notes. Everything was there. And what was equally staggering about these materials was the range of disciplines they represented. This wasn't just an archive of performance, but of the alternative or counter or DIY culture of the 70s that went on to change the world. A culture where there were all kinds of crossovers and collaborations and connections between disciplines as artists set out to do things differently, were inspired by each other's ideas and forms and approaches. With stand-up comedy and performance art bounced off each other. Filmmakers and musicians swapped ideas. Neil showed, in his introduction, he showed a poster for the Taboo event at the Zap Club, which single-handedly represented the whole interdisciplinarity with its lineup of Mark Almond, Kathy Acker, Lydia Lunch, Cozy Fanatuti, Kerrithwin Evans, John Mabry, and neo-naturists. So it made perfect sense that Roger's archive included stuff about experimental filmmakers like John and visual artists like Kerrithwin Ruth Evans, performance poetry, stand-up, experimental music. You had a whole bunch of stuff on Robin Gristle, other punk and post-punk artists like Lydia Lunch, heaps of early days of identity politics and alternative cultures, and even the audio tapes of his interview with Kenneth Williams. Williams, Burroughs, Jarman, Acker, who else could have all of these icons in one box but Roger Ely? The assembled documents and the documentation of artists, moments, movements and practices contained within his archive reflect so many of the huge shifts that we've experienced since the 1970s. Collectively, they represent a unique body of materials that characterise a critical but relatively unwritten about period in UK cultural history, and one that laid the foundations and assembled the building blocks and the jigsaw pieces for now. Roger got an Arts Council grant to develop his archive, and he was working on it until his death with young Bob Hobbs. The archive, I think, is a national treasure, and I really hope that the work will continue, that it will be put in order, and that it will find the home it deserves. But Roger's archive, like the best of them, was part record, but also part recall. Roger had a ton of materials, but he also had a ton of tales to tell. And although the archive is a brilliant resource, it would always be profoundly diminished without his animating, captivating presence. Thank you, Roger. You are much missed, but your legacy will live on.